Welcome everybody to our lecture, our historical perspectives on osteopathic medicine lecture this evening. Once again, we welcome Jason Haxton, the director of the Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine's museum, or the Museum of Osteopathic Medicine. We're grateful to have him back. Hopefully you've had a chance to see some of our earlier lectures. If not, they are available on DOCME and available for you to watch again if you'd like to. There's a brief bio here. We won't go into any of the details. We put these up here because we're required to, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. But as you know, I am the president of MAOPS. I work in family medicine and just have a great interest in learning about my osteopathic roots because I think it makes us better physicians by understanding where we came from. Jason's history is here as well. His is actually much more interesting and well-traveled than my own. Lots of great things. But again, we're grateful for him, for the history that he's leaving and the legacy that he's leaving of AT Still for us and for all future DOs. So we're grateful grateful for him, and we've got a great talk. Our objectives, our disclosures are that neither he nor I have any financial or relevant disclosures to disclose at this time. Our webinar objectives are listed there, and we're going to go over these throughout the remainder of this evening. So again, thank you. A little bit of housekeeping as we're doing this, just to remind you, if you have questions, I do monitor the chat throughout this, so feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I will bring them up as we're going through the lecture. At the end of the chat, we'll have time for questions and answers at that point. If you'd like to ask them, you can use your raise your hand feature and ask, or you can just type them in the chat again. This lecture tonight is the moving on from AT Still, or the next generation. We spend a lot of time in medical school discussing the history of our organizations. One of the reasons I like osteopathic medicine is we have such a rich history and culture that was, at least for me in my Kirksville experience, was very integrated into the curriculum. Maybe it was easier because we were still practicing in some of those halls that, you know, the physicians before us were practicing in, and every day we walked by the cabin that was sitting there, or the first school, I should say, that was sitting there in the atrium of the institution we were training at. And then the halls were just filled with pictures and historical pictures, that some of which Jason's already got pulled up here, and those are pictures that are familiar to me simply because we saw them every day in school. But it's great to learn about these things and learn, where did these techniques come from, and why did we get to where we are today. And what we're going to talk about today is the next generations after AT Still. What happened next? What are some prominent early osteopathic physicians beyond AT Still? How did his legacy begin, really? You know, we could say our legacies typically begin after we end, and we're going to talk about that tonight. So we're very excited for this, Jason. And again, welcome back, and I'll turn it over to you to get this thing kicked off.
Good. Well, and you ask all your great questions again, but you're right. Students, after they leave AT Still University in Kirksville, they say, you know, we were never more than 3 feet from Dr. Still's gaze. And that kind of put some pressure on us to see what we could do to take this idea of healthcare further. And so, and some of them say, you know, I walked past that schoolhouse and the cabin every single day, and I didn't realize till I left Kirksville how much I missed those things that I could enjoy every single day. So we do have a great history in Kirksville, and we invite everybody to come up to see just the historic places and feel that great history. So I show this picture. I love this picture of Dr. Still. I always call it the kindly Dr. Still. But if you notice, he doesn't look at the camera. He rarely looks at the camera because he'd rather look at people. And so I think even when you look at his gaze, if you look closely, it's never at the camera. It's whoever's over to the side. But here we have a great picture of his wife to the left of him, some children of student doctors, and a variety of people, just as it is today. It's great to see the partners and spouses and kids, and many more. Usually they start off with maybe a kid or no kid, and they leave with 2 or 3.
Which is a still tradition that comes on today. I can testify to that. So
How many did you leave with at graduation?
So we actually started with one child at when we started medical school. She was about 10 months old. We had one during the first 2 years, and we had another one during the second 2 years there. So, or the third and fourth year. So we ended up leaving with 3 children. Yes.
So producing the next generation, though, I think, as we said, we like our kids to have freedom to pick what they want. Dr. Still's children didn't. I mean, it was kind of like all hands on deck. And so they didn't get that opportunity. They all had to become DOs, which is kind of, tough.
And tell me exactly, how many children did Dr. Still have?
Well, of course, his first wife died, and the majority of the children did, all but one. And she held him responsible for her mother's death and poor sanitation of the well. They drank bad water, and most of the kids died. The reason Dr. Still didn't die, and the oldest daughter, was that they took the well water and made coffee. So they boiled this literally foul water. A hen had fell into it and polluted it. And so they all got sick from the bacteria, the kids, and they died one after another. And so here he was with his wife and the kids all dead. And the oldest daughter just said, I have nothing to do with you. So he starts a whole new family. So he has a son, and then he has twin boys, then he has another son, and then they have a daughter. So those were the children of Dr. Still's kind of second family.
And they all became osteopathic physicians for that early school, huh?
Kind of. That's a good question, because actually they did become osteopaths and they helped out. But later in life, for instance, the oldest son actually became a politician. He worked as the mayor in Kirksville and then went on as a House of Representatives and did great work for the state of Missouri in the legal issues. As we know from MAOPS and working on our little hill, that you will see things in Jefferson City still because of Charles Still, who basically built hospitals and did things in that line. Then of the twins, one of the twins became a banker. He had an interest in making money and speculating. Now, granted, that bank could then fund other schools and other issues that supported scholarships and things that supported the students. So there was an osteopathic connection, but it was an independent business. Now, the other twin, there's always a black sheep. He's the evil twin. And what's said about him was the fact that he lived well and never worked. He often claimed he could do a lot of osteopathy and make quick money, but he was lazy. And so basically we have Harry, the banker, and then his brother, the not so good brother. And then we had Fred, and Fred was Dr. Still's darling child, just like him. Money didn't interest him, loved people, loved nature, but he's messing around in the bar and gets crushed by a horse and dies from the injuries, dies on graduation day. So the class graduates, but they don't celebrate the first class of osteopathic healthcare. And then there's the daughter, Blanche, and she is very young. She becomes an osteopath, but she takes care of AT Still and does all the administration work. And so she really doesn't get a chance to practice so much. And she goes into breeding exotic cows, basically Guernsey and Jersey cattle with the best cream. So it is interesting that they all did go into other things as a sideline. So,
But Dad all made them go to school, his school, and graduate from it at
least. He did, and they were all always somewhat involved. And so what Dr. Still had to say is osteopathic healthcare is progressive. It grows. It's not done. And each person who studies will be able to do their part to push this further. That it's unlimited. And I think this is what's fun when we look at these early students who were trained by Dr. Still, and then the students that were trained by those students that did significant things. So his hope was that every osteopath would go on and search for scientific facts and work on the human mechanism, the anatomy and health, and extend the truths. And this is kind of where we are today. We're always looking at this. So I think it's great that his lack of ego, and this is mine, this was a gift to the world. And Dr. Still really said, I've done as much as I can. Pick it up and run with it. And make it yours. Don't just, mimic me. Do it your way.
Now, this is a different picture of Dr. Still, this last picture you had. It looks like he's a much younger man in this picture.
It is, and actually, he probably hadn't even started the school. This picture's from about 1880. He was doing osteopathic healthcare, but at that time, he was going from little one-room schoolhouse or anywhere that people would listen to him, and he'd have his bag of human bones here, a femur and a pelvis, describing the things that he could adjust and work with human anatomy and OMM. And of course, the first class, as we look in this picture, we actually get to see, there are 5 of the 6 women in this picture. And we look, we see Fred. If we look to Dr. Still in the middle with the skeleton, and then just lower below him, there is a woman, that is Nettie Bowles. And next to Nettie Bowles is Fred, who again, dies on graduation day, really sad. But Nettie was an interesting kind of character. She is the one who challenged Dr. Still. Can a woman actually learn this? Now, she had known Dr. Still in Kansas. Her dad was actually in the Civil War, and they fought side by side. Her father was injured, was shot, and A.T. Still kept him alive, saved his life. So after he dies, and years later, when her mother becomes paralyzed and unable to walk because of a fall, she decides to come find Dr. Still, and she comes to Kirksville. And again, he hasn't started the school quite yet. And he works on her mother, and she's able to get better and walk again. And Nettie says, this is something I'd like to do. Now, again, she had a University of Kansas training. She was a sharp student, and she does, start on. Dr. Still actually says, I want you to come and be part of this first class. And so, when the professor of anatomy, the English chap, William Smith, leaves after a year, they don't have an anatomy instructor. Well, she takes her knowledge and stuff, and she actually steps in and becomes the second faculty. And then she edits the Journal of Osteopathy, the first scientific, research magazine. And then she later on starts her own school in Denver, the Bowles Institute. And so it's kind of interesting. We still have, a school in Colorado. So it's kind of exciting.
Hey, Jason, we're getting a little bit of feedback from your microphone. I don't know if it's the one from your headset or if there's one that it's picking up on your computer or something. Just letting you know, there was a little bit of feedback coming on through there. So I don't know. I'll let you know if it keeps happening.
Okay. Well, for now, this is the only mic I've got, so I think we'll go on.
That's fine. Hey, before we move on from this picture, though, there's multiple females in this, and because of the black and white, and everybody's wearing black, sometimes it's hard to miss. How many females are in this? Graduating class here, this first class?
Well, and the thing is, it was tough times, so the women are rather mannish because it was hard. But
nobody's smiling.
No, that too, you couldn't move because otherwise you'd be a blur. But as we look on the second row, there are actually 3 women. Starting at the far right, there's a woman in a dress, Fred, Nettie. We jump past the skeleton. That's A.T. Still's brother, Ed, the eldest. And then there's another woman in the picture. And then if we move up to the top row, we see little petite, his daughter, and then we go all the way over and we see the last woman. So, so kind of Blanche as the daughter. Everybody was named Martha because you tributed the mother. So Blanche's real name is Martha, but it's hard to, so I always think it's like, but her nickname was Blanche, or it was somewhere in one of 5 or 6 different names. But these are the women, the original, and there's one woman that didn't get in the picture, as sometimes happens.
I just think it's a great part of our history that, we had females in our very first class on, and they actually make up a majority of the medical students today, which is a national trend in medicine. But I just think it's great of the inclusiveness of A.T. Still, because I have a feeling, and we don't have the statistics, but I'd be interested to see what the percentage of medical school classes outside of osteopathic medicine would be during that time frame. And I have a feeling there'd be much smaller percentages of women involved in medicine at the time, at least.
It's true. And A.T. Still daughter's Blanche, she wrote articles because she was rather feminine and beautiful herself for the time period. And it's like, just because you're a physician doesn't make you some freak or not a woman. And so you can see, look how many women in the second class. I mean, already it looks like almost half the women, half the class, it grows a little bit, but look how many more women are in this 1895 picture, which would again be the second graduating class. So kind of fun. And the woman we want to point out in this is to the far left. If you look, there's a man seated and a little kid behind him. That's his daughter. That's Henry and Patterson, and that's Lee. And so A.T. still like to nickname her Lee Pat. And then next to Lee is the mother, Alice. And so the Pattersons, the reason they were not in the first class is they were busy doing the work. And here you can see Dr. Still teasing and taunting Alice, who was, again, taught women's health. It's great to have women's health taught by a woman. But she was not only A.T. Still's personal assistant, but she developed her own osteopathic techniques while she wasn't even in class yet. She taught women's health, and she made Dr. Still aware that there should always be an option for a woman physician. Not that we expect every woman to want it, but they should be able to have an option of a female or a male physician, and they should pick. And so with Henry was the secretary at the school. He was the lawyer. He took care of the facilities. He was also going to Jefferson City with Arthur Hildreth and getting the new law of osteopathy legally passed. So this was a very active and a very involved family. Now, Alice would tell you that she always knew Dr. Still, even as a child, when he went to school, he was just kind of itinerant and moving around. He was always her family doctor. Her family trusted him. She'd known him since she was a kid. So he had a lot of faith and trust in her. Now, as they are successful, they decide to go to Washington, D.C. and promote osteopathic medicine through the House and the Senate. And then they go on to internationally expand osteopathy. So Alice is a very important woman in osteopathic healthcare. So some people have never heard of Edith Ashmore. Edith is an interesting character. Again, very early on, head of the OMM department, a woman. Again, this is only because of Dr. Still's, seeing that we don't just give lip service. We get women and we make them work. As today, we would look at, we had Karen Schneider for a while in charge of OMM, and now she does other work. But it goes to show this is, not unusual. But what Edith wrote was a book called Osteopathic Mechanics in 1915. And I challenge you, if you haven't read it, to get it. It was so good a book. It was basically a contribution to non-osteopathic scientists. And so she was great. And what she had to say was, don't mimic Dr. Still's technique. Develop your own. Dr. Still's an old man. You don't want to be working like an old man. You work with your young, work with your body type. If you're petite or if you're strong or if you're heavy set, use your skill and come forward with it. It's kind of like any sport. Golf is golf, but each person brings their body form and physiology to make it work, So, and Edith went on and actually took a course in the early chiropractic, paid the money. And when it was done, she says, all I'm seeing is that the chiropractic school is doing the early stuff that Dr. Still taught. We have moved on. And so it appears this is just a copy from what Dr. Still's early work was. So, a little controversial there. Are you familiar with Frank Chapman and the Chapman reflexes, Dr. Brown?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm pretty sure, if I recall, it's been a few years, but I think those were on some of my Comlex exams as well.
Of course. Here we can actually see some of the pressure points and things, looking at the lymphatics and the nervous system. What the Chapman reflex is initially he was looking at a new area of what we call the lesion or somatic dysfunction, and looked to the lymphatic areas, which tend to swell and tend to be very sore. And this is the congestion. And so this would give you a hint as to where these areas, where adjustments might be needed. And so, of course, he distinguished over 200 different areas that you could find and then treat and adjust. And so kind of, and to this day, people still use the Chapman reflexes.
Can you tell, how did he get involved with osteopathic medicine? Where, was he in the earlier classes? What was, or do you know?
I really don't. I know that he was actually in 1899. So he would have been, at a time when the English chaps were there, where there was a lot of discovery. So we had the Little Johns there. Smith had come back. The school was now 600 students. In 1899, Sutherland had arrived, and we're going to talk about William Sutherland in just a second. But he must have come from the South because his practice was down in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Probably didn't like the cold weather of Kirksville. Who can blame him?
600 students. That's not much different than the size today. I mean, it's a little bit smaller, but that's a pretty decent size school by then.
Right, because it was running classes of 200, which would be appropriate today, 3 times a year.
Okay.
Now, I love this name of the next person. Some people call her Louisa and some call her Louisa. So it's kind of like Missouri or Missouri. But Louisa Burns from the Pacific College out in California, she was, as we would look at research, she was the woman that stood out from this. She really spent her life looking at basically researching, proving, and initially what was called the Still Research Institute was where doctors of osteopathy that had graduated could go and get kind of an advanced degree. And that's when they would do research to get the higher medical degree. But they didn't get a lot of people attending. So they just went to pure research. But as always, it was never well funded. And Louisa, to her credit, wrote multiple books, used the proceeds to keep the whole research institute afloat. She pretty much died in poverty, which is a little bit sad, but she was totally devoted to osteopathic health care.
I wonder if she has any relationship to our last year's AOA president, Dr. Burns.
I don't know. I don't remember her being married with kids. I think, like many of these women, osteopathic medicine became kind of their life and their whole world.
It'd be
now
interesting to do a study of where some of these today, because we know that a lot of these families' medicine runs deep. It'd be interesting to see how many of these people impacted physicians today and through their families.
It is interesting, these legacy families that go generation after generation, because they really are into helping and particularly the osteopathic healthcare way. Now we have the Still Institute still today, and that's run under the very young Brian Degenhardt. He's a lot grayer. His hair is just now gray, but again, he continues to look at ways to teach osteopathic manipulation more accurately, using models, using 3D imagery, using pressure, so that it's not just in the old days where some professor would come up and would feel the patient and go, okay, now you would do it. And then they would tell you what it is. Here, you actually can see what you're doing and what's going on. So again, a huge benefit to making accuracy in working with OMM. And now the famous William Sutherland. Everybody's probably heard of cranial manipulation. It's a whole different baby, so to speak. I mean, you can do it and you're good at it, or you're kind of not. What is your thought on that, Dr. Brown?
No, so I actually took the extra course that they offered at ATSU. We did it during like one of our summer breaks, and I find it fascinating. It's I haven't had as much opportunity for, implementing it into my practice, but I definitely think that it's, like everything else that we use, that it has its applications. I find it fascinating. I actually even was involved enough in it that I have my own completed skull, and I also have what we call an exploded skull model still at home that I use when I, teach my children. Everybody homeschools their kids these days, and so I pull out the anatomy models and show them to them, And then we also pull them out every year around Halloween time. So that's a good time to, use all of Dad's anatomy props. But yeah, no, it definitely played an impact on my education even today.
Excellent. And as you mentioned, the disarticulated or exploded skull, if you look in this photograph, you can see to the right, there is one of these skulls, and we actually have this in the museum, along with, and we'll talk about his apparatus for testing and researching. So you mentioned, where do these people come from? Well, William Sutherland, was a newspaper journalist and a writer. Now, his family came up from Minnesota and North Dakota, South Dakota area, very hand-to-mouth. Father was always out of work, very poor, no stability, family living with family, and always conflict. So as a young boy, he had to bring in income. So he started kind of as a little apprentice, a little running around helping in, because papers were a big deal, and there were 2 papers a day and all this news and stuff. And so you would learn by going from scut work and cleaning trays and stuff to actually setting type, to actually writing. And so he had gained all these skills. And this was a very lucrative, very good position to have. And then the paper world changed with what they called the linotype machine, where you actually just type and you can make basically the newspaper. He was feeling every single letter by hand, different sizes, and they were upside down in reverse. So the sensitivity of his fingers, now we're starting to understand, when he saw that there is no future in the paper, and yet he had all these skills, he comes to then the American School of Osteopathy. He gets the scholarship because he's been writing articles, against the MD, saying, look, why are you out to kill osteopathy? Because, people I talk to really like it. Patients are getting better. And so he's writing very favorable articles, very controversial political articles that give the osteopathic physician a chance. Well, A.T. Still and the secretaries, Warren and all those, and the children say, hey, good publicity helps us. Why don't we give this guy a full scholarship, let him really learn it, and we will even go further, nationally with these articles. So that's kind of why he got this scholarship, was because he was a writer. But then his sensitivity of his fingers, feeling this cranium and the very subtle differences that he was used to, he looked at a whole new way of manipulation. And it began with this skeleton Mike. Poor Mike was the cadaver, and he was literally picked to death because they couldn't get cadavers. It was so difficult. And so he finally gotten down to nothing but bone. And it was his skull that, looking at them, Sutherland said, it looks like these are made to slide, and yet they were locked. He goes, I don't understand. But you see, Dr. Stoll always said, the body is different in death. So it's a good model, but it is not accurate. And so in death, basically the cartilage and stuff actually fuses and becomes like epoxy. If you try to break down the suture, the bone will break instead of the suture. That is how tight. But remember, this has to keep your skull from falling apart when you hit your head or anything. So of course it's very tough material. So Sutherland takes a recently dead body before it's locked, puts beans in, the magnum forum, the hole. And basically as those beans expand, they pull the entire cranium apart. And you can see these little fingerings that are made to lock and match. And so he says, this thing's a respiratory system. This is made to move. This is a breathing apparatus of the body. And so it is kind of fascinating how he comes up with this. And then just to summarize it, the cranial and facial bones are made from moving. And there is a rhythmic and a primary respiratory mechanism, and cerebral fluid coming kind of in and out, kind of like breath. Like the blood, there is this circulatory system going on. And if there are dysfunctions, you can diagnose and treat through manipulation. And so he presented these theories in 1932, and nobody showed up. But within 5 years, he was recognized as one of the greatest advances in osteopathic healthcare. And so we actually, he didn't have subjects. So he would create these helmets and tighten them. He trained his wife how to undo these things, Ada, so that if he went, and often he did, he would go kind of psychotic. and he couldn't even get the thing off his head, and she would be able to bring him back. But of course, this wouldn't be how we do research today, I don't think. And so we might, now, here's the funniest thing. Before I met Viola Fryman, I would always see this picture, but never named. And I wondered who this guy was. And this guy is not very tall. Those who know Viola Fryman, she was only, if she was 4 feet tall, that was giving her a couple inches. So she was very hobbit size and had a very masculine look about her. And she was basically no nonsense kind of woman. And I enjoyed my time getting to know her and finally figured out, but she had the sad situation of she had a child, newborn, and the baby wasn't able to suckle and then would vomit and wasn't able to keep food down. And so was slowly dying. And eventually the child wasted away and died. Within months of this, her death of her child, she hears of Dr. Sutherland. She goes and looks to see what he's doing. And there is a woman with a child with the exact same condition. And Sutherland treats the cranium. The child is able to keep down food and survives. She dedicates the rest of her life to basically children and making sure that no one suffers what she did, the loss of a child. So again, people are always motivated by these losses, you know. And so still in the realm of cranial manipulation, Charlotte Weaver was kind of an unknown until recently. Charlotte Weaver attended the school, graduates in 1912, and Dr. Still goes to her specifically, not Sutherland. He goes to Charlotte Weaver and says, I've been so busy working with anatomy, I haven't gotten to the cranium, which is my interest. And I want you to look into this for me, you know, carry this thing. It was the same by 1917, 18. She's treating patients, the Spanish flu, which is their COVID. She gets sick, he gets sick, her husband, the love of her life, he dies. When she comes to, her husband's dead. And so she devotes her life to this idea of helping, again, initially children with cranial manipulation. And as he said, we can treat everyone from the toe to the hole in the base of the skull, the foramen magnum. But he wants you to follow the scroll. He saw that hole like a tree, like a hole in a tree, and what's inside you never know. Reach in there, pull that squirrel out by the tail, and tell us what it's about. And so Charlotte spends 25 years looking at this. And what she comes up with is that the cranium are 3 modified vertebrae. And if you look at this picture of this infant's skull, you can see the 3 pieces and you see a separation just as you would. And then of course it expands around to create the skull. And so the hole that we have in our vertebrae all the way down is the hole that connects to create where the rest of the nerve, the brain, is. Now, just as the sacrum fuses together, but has mobility, so does the top. So the bottom and the top mimic each other with basically modulated vertebrae. And so it is fantastic what she's, but because we were moving in towards a more medical direction and not looking at the osteopathy, her stuff wasn't promoted. And so she said, I've worked 25 years. It's accurate. She put it away. She just went and did manipulation and did her stuff and dies in obscurity. And we read these articles that she wrote and we go back and find her material. So she looked at embryology from the growth of embryology, the growth of the cranium from the inside out. Sutherland was looking at the outside in. So 2 very different ways of learning and doing cranium. So.
Fascinating. We had a couple of comments, just so you know, Jason, of people who, you know, worked under Dr. Fryman, including Dr. Gary Brown there, and trained with her there at the College of Osteopathic Medicine in the Pacific there. So that's,
and I'm glad, you know, one of the things that I think is interesting, we're going to get to Fulford, but she used live music. She used music, but it had to be played and live during treatment, which is very expensive to
Yeah.
have your own pianist while you're treating a child.
Interesting.
But it was that different. You know, certainly you can play music.
I've always been thinking of putting a string quartet in my waiting room. So that's good to know.
Well, we'll talk about vibration in the body and fascia in just a little bit when we get to Fulford. However, that is again one of those amazing things about Viola Friedman. She didn't cut corners. You do what it takes, and in her case, it was live music. Some of you are familiar with the various Mitchells. There's Fred Mitchell Sr. and there's Fred Mitchell Jr. And then there's also K.O., their son, who isn't a DO but knows all the stuff from the family because again entrenched in it. But again, we get all these people from Tennessee. What's down there? So anyway, a graduate of Tennessee. But what Fred Mitchell was known for is what we call muscle energy technique. And of course, this was initially in the 1950s with treat the pelvis. And then he expanded it to include all the joints of the body and in the head and the cranium. But again, the patient kind of works as a team, which I think is what's exciting about this form of care, is that, you know, we're moving the affective area into a very controlled position, and then the physician applies a counter force, and then things want to go back to normal. And Dr. Still always said, the body wants to be in correct alignment. And there are some people who said, you know, if you didn't do OMM, eventually it'd find its way back. You know, when all of a sudden somebody hits us and you go, oof, and something kind of pops, and like, oh, it's like, I've had that happen in my life. Also, it's like, oh, something went back. So anyway, so that's what we know for Dr. Mitchell and his muscle energy technique. And I told you we wanted to get to Fulford, percussion technique. What I like about Robert Fulford is a couple things, but one is, again, the vibration, the electric kind of current of the body. And what Robert Fulford is also known for is that in order to be present with your patient, and we've talked this in a couple other lectures, you need to truly love your patient. You need to have absolute care. And when you have that, there's nothing else in your mind. There is not how cold it is outside or what you've got to do when you get it. There is only you and your patient, and there becomes a soul-to-soul connection, as Dr. Still called it. So he just said that you truly cannot short circuit this. You really have to, it's not so much technique as being invested and opening yourself to get that message and connection with your patient. Any thoughts on that, Dr. Brown?
No, I mean, those are our core principles we're all taught as osteopathic physicians, and I think what separates us, I don't think osteopathic medicine has a monopoly on being invested and being so involved and knowing your patient, but I sure believe it's a part of our culture and our core values. And so I feel like we get that as a foundation, and I think that makes all the difference in the world.
I would agree. And so when we look at optimism, when you really believe your physician is there for you and is looking out for you, you feel it, you know it, and your body actually kicks in the parasympathetic and the immunity system stuff, things do happen. And this was what Fulford was saying. It's not hocus pocus. No, physically, anatomy, physiology, things happen when your patient starts internalizing and believing you're there for them. And that is what happens when you truly know they're invested in you. So kind of cool. So when we look at the percussion technique, he began using this again in the 50s. So he's a kind of a generation after those early people that we talked with, Dr. Still. And he delivering a mechanical energy using a hammer. So it's kind of like a little, you watch kind of like an earthquake. You watch the whole earth tremor like liquid. If you've ever seen one of these California earthquakes, and all of a sudden the land just starts to turn into liquid, it looks like. So does your body when you put one of these hammers. And I have to be honest, I have had them used on me to great effect. And so it affects the affected tissue. But the whole purpose is to release any blockage in the flow of the piezoelectric current, which is basically, when we look at through the fascia and stuff, it's the natural body's current. And things that get stuck And this is what Dr. Still says, abnormal is stuck, and we want to release things and get them back. But things can be stuck because of trauma. What was described by him, by Dr. Koss, if you know Richard Koss, who's amazing. And of course, he was a student of Fulford for a decade and a half, I think. I mean, longer than anyone else. But, you know, when there is an impact, so when your car hits something, it all crumples up. And then you got to kind of uncrumple. All that energy goes into it and changes it. Same with our soft. When we get hit or we have some trauma, it is absorbed by the body. And so that's what we look at. When we look at piezoelectric, we're thinking of things that hold energy, like quartz. Quartz will actually maintain energy. Bones, they actually hold energy. And when you hit quartz, actually more energy can come out than went in. And this is what he's talking about, is releasing this maybe pent up energy. So if you have a trauma, your body has absorbed this impact, and it might still be stuck there, both physically and emotionally. You may be holding that injury in yourself. The idea is to release that so things can go back to normal. So it's a really fascinating work of Fulford. A lot of people really follow Fulford.
You know what's actually interesting about this is that these, I don't know if you're aware, but percussion massage, you know, it's what they call it, but this has become mainstream now. You can go get one now on Amazon for $100 or less. You know, whereas, you know, when I was in medical school, it was a very expensive device, but they have some new ones that are, you know, lithium ion run, and you can get them, and, you know, they sell them as percussion massagers is what they call them. And they're portable, no cords, anything, but they're exactly like the percussion hammers that we used to use in school. And they have that frequency. So it's very interesting. And they're all advertised for sports injuries. They have pictures of, you know, people with a strained muscle, and you have it there. And it's just very fascinating how mainstream this has become, because of, you know, partly I think because of the technology now that you can, you know, get a lithium ion battery and have this together. So it's quite amazing how this is, you know, having a resurgence right now, you might say. When I go to running fairs, I like to run, and, you know, before I go to, you know, the race, there's usually like a fair, a health fair or something beforehand, and these are all over now for runners to use, you know, on their hamstrings and things after they go on long runs.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like when you go to the ocean, and you know, you initially you get in the waves and you're kind of fighting them, but at some point you realize that this power is greater than you, and you just give into it, and suddenly you're just kind of washed over, and it just kind of, and your whole body relaxes because you cannot fight it so long. And as that relaxing, you start releasing things. You start to feel basically that power starting to purify you, so to speak. So I am fascinated by what Fulford had to do. And of course, he worked with crystals, and I go, woo. But I mean, you know, again, the more we learn, again, he was looking at the control, the energy that could be in us, and how we can learn from this and use it. Another word that you know, strain, counter strain. I mean, that is just kind of standard in OMM. And that was started by a Dr. Lawrence Jones. Again, more of a second generation. He was in the school after A.T. Still, a class of 36. And what we hear from the class, you know, those in the 30s, after the 30s, something was lost in true osteopathic manipulation and attitude, that we moved very medical and we gave away some things. And you always heard, when I knew some of the graduates from the 30s, Dr. Dorian Farnham, who was one of our last graduates, and he lived to be 105, that he felt that those in the 40s, you know, didn't learn the way and didn't respect what was being given to them. And, you know, that was one of the things we hear. But when we look at strain and counter strain, and also called the positional release technique, you know, the practitioner wants you to be passive in a body position, and then kind of works and compresses and releases those affected joints. And so trying to get the affected a normal tone, and getting things kind of back in a greater range of motion. And we see Dr. Still, there's one a little video clip of him, and that's what he's doing. Is he's probably, you know, doing a rib raising, and of course he swings the arm around and kind of lets things go back the way they should.
I was just pulling off my shelf my counter strain approach book that I got from medical school, still on my shelf and still something that I reference. It is written, you know, the authors obviously talk about Dr. Jones and his impact on that and how he was the inspiration for that book. So
Excellent. Cool. Well, it's nice to know you walk the talk, Dr. Brown. Now, this is not a physician, but probably the most important person to anatomy, physiology, the parasympathetic, homeostasis, you know, those aspects that we really benefited from was Irvin Core. But if you looked at his initials, Irvin M. Core, when he would get things, it would be Core Irvin M. So he just called himself Kim. So that's where Kim comes from, that's his initials when you're using his last name first. I don't know. So everybody knew him as Kim, which he was an interesting character. Now, he was so brilliant. He was from the East Coast, Yale, Harvard. You know, he actually was at the university, I think it was Yale, when he was with, let me double check his Princeton. Anyway, needless to say, he was with Einstein. Einstein was actually a professor on the campus. And he tells a story that, I mean, they just happened to end up often walking side by side because of their just normal schedule. And he says he was doing one of these walks one day and some young kids were playing with a Frisbee. Must have been just brand new at that time. And this Frisbee kind of fell at Einstein's feet. And he kind of picks it up, looks at it, gives it a flip, and was kind of fascinated by this. He says another time he followed him and there was this sidewalk with an elevator that dropped down and they were bringing things out of the basement up to ground level, up and down. And he goes, he sat and watched that. He goes, I just watched him watch that for over a half an hour of things going down and things coming up. And he was just watching the process. So it is interesting. But again, he was used in the military for hypothermia. His understanding of physiology and the body and how it works was off the charts. But he made a mistake. During that time, a student invited him to a communist meeting. And communism isn't what we think it is today. It really, I mean, in the sense of, and so he attended this meeting as a professor, just because his students invited him. Not that it was earth-changing or anything, but through the war, they used his knowledge. But as soon as the war was over, the McCarthy, he was labeled a communist and he couldn't get work. And so his kind of mentor said, look, you're going to have to cool your heels. Because of this little incident, you need to go away for a few years and then come back and everything will be fine. And I've got just the place to send you. Go down to Kirksville, see this thing called lesions, somatic dysfunction, and go down there and study that and spend a few years and then come back and everything will be fine. Well, the thing was, he came back down and he never left because he became so fascinated by what was going on. And the aging process, you know, Kim always looked 10 or 20 years younger than he was. As I like to say, I'm going around saying I'm 50 because osteopathic medicine, even though I'm 63, I think makes me think that I'm almost 50 because I follow a lot of the good practices as he did. And so needless to say, we were benefited. So he looked at the parasympathetic nervous system and basically the things we don't control, such as stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, how when you're agitated and your stress level is high, we go up and then the body, all the heart, everything comes back down. But if there's an extended process, it's like stripping the wires so that they stay hot and they don't know how to return down. And so this was a lot of his focus and certainly beneficial to what we do. And we know how stress can affect the whole body today, you know, constant stress. Okay. I was going to say for a second.
No, my video went out for a second there. I didn't know why. I was just sharing in the chat a link to the modern day version of Dr. Fulford's percussion hammer there for anybody who wants to see. You can buy one on Amazon now. So
Do your own percussion technique. Do it on your children.
You do
Your
it now,
spouse.
or you just don't need the cord anymore. I remember that was the hard part of that machine, was it was heavy and had a short cord.
There it is. Well, many of you would, Dr. Paul Kimberly hasn't been gone so long that even though he basically was born in 1915, a long life, and what he offered basically came from the Des Moines School, but what he offered in teaching techniques, and what we know from Dr. Paul Kimberly was combined treatment, where there are 3 different groups that we look at: soft tissue. Of course, we always know there's soft tissue, articulatory, and then specific joint restriction. And that you look at all of these and approach kind of the biomechanical as well as the physiological ways, and use techniques that are direct and indirect to release these abnormalities. So again, kind of fascinating when we think of Dr. Kimberly's work. And he was the one that we have a video demonstrating how to use the McManus table, which many people still use today. He was a whiz at that and making it work.
And that one I also have on my desk, and that is Dr. Kimberly's manual, which is the manual I still reference when I want to review osteopathic techniques. So.
Excellent, excellent. As we kind of come towards the end here, we want to look at some of those generation people that were with Dr. Still who took osteopathic medicine overseas. So we've been looking at the United States, but John Martin Littlejohn, particularly, he was more of an educator, but he also looked at psychology. He did the first research on dogs and manipulation. And so he basically studies at the school. They go to Chicago and start, he and his brothers, their own school, the Littlejohn School, which later they sell and becomes the Chicago School. So Midwestern is actually basically a descendant of the Littlejohn School. Now, John Martin Littlejohn, when they sell the school in Chicago, takes the money, goes back home to England. His wife is wanting, she's English and she wants to go back. He's got kids, and he basically goes and returns home and starts osteopathic medicine in England, so which is called the British School of Osteopathy. So as we look here, he was a professor of physiology in 1897. So if you look in this row, Dr. Still's in the middle. Go to the top row. Basically his nephew, that's Sutherland, who started the Des Moines School, on his head. And if then you go over to, there's a bearded, rather praying mantis looking man. That's John Martin Littlejohn. Now, I tease him about looking like a praying mantis. I mean, come on. He had the audacity to think that Blanche, who was a looker, would actually be interested in him. And so, being kind of the logical guy from England that he was, he gave her the Encyclopedia Britannica. Blanche was not impressed. She wanted chocolates, flowers, and pretty things. So she ends up marrying George Laughlin. Forget Littlejohn. But anyway, he marries a good English woman who probably enjoyed the books. But as we look here, here's a picture of him, when he's teaching, and then lost the beard, probably a good idea as a graduate. And he became the dean. Actually, that was important because the school with 600 people were growing and they needed a structure. He'd already been basically the principal or the president of a religious school. So he was used to running a school and doing a pretty good job. So when we look at basically, the professors, the whole bottom row are all from Europe. We have William Smith, who taught anatomy and X-radiance, which was new. John Martin Littlejohn, who was basically the dean and physiology professor. His brother James, who was a real surgeon. So he did a lot of the surgery at the American School of Osteopathy. And then their little brother David, the last one, he taught public health, STDs, venereal disease, and helped William Smith with X-radiance. So again, very important people from Europe. So as I mentioned, they started their own school, the Littlejohn School. There we see in 1912. In 1913, it sells to some of our professors of that time, McConnell and basically Proctor, who taught anatomy. They basically buy the school in Chicago and make it what it is today. And here we see the British School of Osteopathy. It lasted 100 years, and literally a month after it was 100 years old, they changed the name to the University College of Osteopathy. It became a part of the standard university system, which is good. It was no longer independent. It is now standard education in England. And so really excellent. Last two amazing women I want to talk about. Some of you may know Phyllis Blondefeld, but when Dr. Tinning was president, he had a bad accident. He kept thinking he would come back. He never did. And so during an interim period, Phyllis, who had been his key assistant and worked with him, executive administrator, she becomes the president while they look for a new president. And so we do actually have had a woman president at A.T. Still University, which is exciting. And of course, still our dean, Maggie Wilson, Dean Margaret Wilson. And again, in MD schools, it would probably be unusual to have a woman dean, but as we can see from our history, we've had women running and doing things at A.T. Still University or the American School since our inception. And again, we find this as one of the benefits of the osteopathic education is that women have a prominent role and are great role models for all of our students. And so kind of throw that out there. And that's kind of our lecture today.
Well, that's been wonderful lecture. Great to learn about all these different individuals, some of them that are very close to us still, and we can, we can either remember them or we're connected to them very closely. At this point, is there anybody that has any questions that's on the call with us this evening? You're welcome to type them in the chat, or you're welcome to raise your hand if you're bold enough that you want to come on here live, and we can give you the ability to chat with us. But do we have any questions from anybody here regarding any of these individuals or for Jason in general? Not seeing any new ones. We've had lots of great comments about people that knew some of these individuals that you're talking about. I do want to make sure that everybody's aware before we end here about our upcoming virtual osteopathic conference. That's from April 16th to the 18th. We're partnering with multiple other states. Have the opportunity to obtain up to 48 different CME credits. There's going to be lots of lectures available. Going to be a really great opportunity that you'll be able to access all the way up through June after the conference starts. So so be sure to definitely look into that. And then, Jason, we do have a question from Dr. Cynthia Byler about, do you have any information to share about Edna Lay?
Yeah, thanks. And Dr. Byler, it's good to see you, kind of. Edna Lay, again, was up in the Northeast area and practiced, oh gosh, they call it the Berkshires. There's actually an osteopathic group, the Berkshires, which is that area up there. And they were pretty much her mentees and looked after her and took care of her. And she was active well into her 90s, still teaching. I'm trying to think if she was in a little trailer, but her hearing wasn't so good, but people would, for phone calls and stuff like that, but people would show up and then she would then demonstrate, kind of her knowledge of working, with all these great people that were, because she was so old, she'd actually known everybody and could use, testimonials and demonstrations. And again, I guess I'm familiar with, she was probably one of our best, and I'm glad to get to name her. There was, and people would come from England. She was so well known, would come to take coursework with her, up in, that area. So, when we look at Northeast, United States and the Berkshires, where she was kind of, again, her area was at. So I don't know if that's a lot. I'd like to do more, but she was kind of a no nonsense person, as Viola Fryman and a lot of these women are. Get to work.
Well, again, thank you, Jason, for a wonderful evening. You're a virtual who's who of osteopathic medicine and history, and we're grateful to be able to learn from what you've learned and share. So thank you, everybody, for participating this evening. We really are glad to have you here in this hopefully warm fireside chat for you, because I know it's cold across the whole state. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Jason, thank you again. We really appreciate you and your wisdom.